Hello and welcome to the program. Every year, the 15th of September marks the International Day of Democracy. This is a good time to talk about strengthening democratic institutions and achieving transparency and integrity in the Ukrainian political process. To talk more about the program, we are joined in the studio today by Marcus Brand, Democratic Governance Advisor at the UNDP. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon.
First, for the viewers to understand, what means the 15th of September and what is this International Day of Democracy?
Well, as you know, the United Nations has a whole range of international days, from human rights to anti-corruption. In 2006, actually, it was an international conference on new and restored democracies that brought together a number of countries that proposed to the United Nations General Assembly to institute also a day of democracy. And a few years later, the General Assembly took that decision to celebrate on the 15th of September, and to basically also signal that the United Nations is very much supporting democracy and democratic governance, even though it recognizes that there are many different forms, different electoral systems, different types of constitutions. But democracy very much forms part of the global international human rights framework and as considered the best form of governance to achieve sustainable development.
So now here in Ukraine, will there be celebrations, will there be conferences, will there be lectures from UNDP?
Well, the Day of International, it's up to member states of the United Nations on how they want to commemorate or celebrate. We work on democracy on a daily basis, but it is, of course, a good opportunity to also remind the connection between the UN general role and mandate and what is happening in individual countries. In Ukraine, Ukraine has, of course, been a democracy for more than 25 years, has a democratic constitution, and is firmly committed to democratic reforms, especially over the last 4 or 5 years. And UNDP, as one of the several UN agencies operating in this country, is helping Ukraine, the government and civil society to consolidate and to strengthen these democratic governance reforms.
Now, these democratic reforms passed by certain values that the UNDP defends, as transparency and integrity. Since 2014, did you saw some evolution in that matter, good or bad, in Ukraine?
Well, the revolution of dignity itself was very much an expression by the people of Ukraine for a better form of government, a more honest form of government, and for the return of honesty, integrity and transparency into the way in which decisions are made. You know better on how that has gone over the recent years. I can tell you that a lot of progress has been achieved in terms of transparency, and overall the direction is also very much clear that the whole spectrum of political forces in Ukraine are committed to European values, to the values of international human rights, which also include democratic governance. I can speak more specifically about some of the activities that we have done in this regard, but let me just say that for us at UNDP, we support Ukraine's sustainable development, human development. We also focus very strongly on recovery in the east, in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, but our effort to support democratic governance reform takes place at the national level, but also very much in the regions and at the local level.
Now, that's interesting that you raise the issue of reforms, because election year is approaching, and most of the message that we receive sometimes is because election year is approaching, certain painful reforms. I'm thinking such as the gas, I'm thinking the agrarian reform and so on, might take the risk of being slowed down because it's election, and some reforms might be unpopular. How to tackle this problem?
Well, I would say that the electoral cycle that is starting up now with the presidential and parliamentary elections coming up next year, and then followed by the local elections the year after, that this does in a way represent a challenge to test the solidity of the democratic foundations in this country, but it is also an opportunity. It is an opportunity for a new form of politics to take root, and an opportunity for the political elite basically to reconnect with the general public and to rebuild trust in a way that that leads to better outcomes. I add the local elections because it is important to emphasize that the decentralization reforms have allowed a lot more decision making to take place at the local level, and that actually allows individual citizens to be much closer to the decision making process, and they should also look at the local elections on the various levels as an opportunity to participate.
Now, these elections also saw some familiar faces and see some familiar faces emerge. Do you really see a new generation of politicians emerging through these elections?
Well, what I can say is that I've now been in Ukraine for 3.5 years, and I travel a lot around the country. I meet a lot of people. I meet a lot of people in government institutions, but also in civil society, in business. And I can say that the dynamics of change in this country is enormous, especially from bottom up at the local community level, but also in many youth groups and spaces. There is really a very big drive for change, for rebuilding a country on a different level of integrity. That will sooner or later also translate into a new generation of politicians being represented in parliament, but it is of course up to the voters themselves to decide on who they elect for the various positions. I think what's important is that there is a general atmosphere of encouragement of broader participation and broader engagement. And I think that's why it's so important to establish rules of the game that are fair for everybody, so that new entrants into the political process, and I would emphasize in particular also more women who should be elected into parliament, that they feel safe, that this is a fair game, that there is actually a basis of integrity in the system, and that arguments and best policies should win in the end, and not, for example, who can buy the most expensive PR companies and the biggest PR campaigns.
Now, you're being optimistic on this youth and civil society. What do you see from your point of view as the biggest challenge that Ukraine will face, let's say, in 5–10 years?
Well, the challenges are quite well known and are multiple. There is, of course, the need to restore territorial integrity and to really bring everybody together behind the idea of sovereignty of this country. But then, even then, the tasks are big to rebuild the economy, to include everybody, to make sure nobody is left behind in economic growth. There is quite a lot of inequality that you see when you travel out from Kiev into some of the rural areas. It is very important that development is inclusive and is based on the principle of equality and cohesion. That will certainly be a big problem. Then there is also a very big challenge still of changing the mindsets in the public administration that is still very much hampered by some of the Soviet legacies. But again, a lot of progress has already been made. Public administration reform is in full swing.
E-declarations also help.
There is also a lot of progress in terms of transparency, but it will still take some time until all these new tools and mechanisms of transparency will actually have the desired effect of changing mindsets and attitudes. To give you an example, the famous Prozoro system has, of course, been not only used very much in Ukraine, but it has even become a model that people talk about in the whole rest of the world. But there is still a lot of deep-seated bias in some of the decisions on how certain public expenditures are made, and to make sure that business is really separated from politics, there is still quite a lot of a way to go.
So you see, maybe in 10 years, and if that everything goes well, you see Ukraine maybe in 5–10 years as a proper Western modern state?
Well, I think I'm one of many international friends living and working in Ukraine who see an enormous potential in this country. I think if Ukraine gets its reforms right, and if Ukraine manages to maintain the partnerships and friendships that it has built over the years, there is really no obstacle why Ukraine should not only be a wealthy and well-organized country, but it could even be an international leader. And I quite believe that in some of the areas where reforms are taking place now, let's say procurement reform, transparency, that the model that Ukraine is building will in some years be interesting for other countries as well.
Well, thank you for this overview. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio today.
My pleasure.
That was Marcus Brandt, Democratic Governance Advisor at UNDP Ukraine. Thank you for watching the program and stay tuned for the rest.